Welcome to what I am sure is going to be a very interesting evening. We're calling it the Island Agenda Debate. Now, we've asked the parties to provide candidates that can talk to issues beyond specific ridings, and in essence represent the parties for all the Vancouver Island issues and even looking into BC. And here is who they picked. Gene Crowder is the NDP incumbent in the riding of Nanaimo-Cowichan. Gary Lunn is the incumbent Tory in the riding of Saanich, Gulf Islands. Keith Martin is the incumbent Liberal in the riding of Esquimalt, Juan de Fuca. And Andrew Lewis is the deputy leader of the Green Party and a candidate in Saanich, Gulf Islands. Okay, those are the candidates. Now on to the panel. Kim Emerson is, of course, a reporter here at CH. Les Lane is a political columnist. I'm going out of order here. I should have gone to Paul next. Paul Vasey is actually the host of CBC Radio's morning show here in Victoria. And Les Lane is a columnist with the Victoria Times Columnist. Now, over the past few weeks, we've solicited questions, both through the CBC and the Times Columnist and here at CH, from people who live on Vancouver Island. They've emailed them to us. We've got them on tape in terms of videotape and an audio tape. And those questions are going to play a very big role in how we do things here tonight. After the questions, which will be introduced by one of the panelists, the candidates are going to have 30 seconds to respond. Then the other three candidates are going to be able to take on what they said, and hopefully we'll have a pretty good debate. Now, let's get it all started. First, with the first question, here's CH's Kim Emerson. Kim?
Thank you, Ed. When Canadians are asked what the most important issue to them is during the course of an election, consistently health care comes out on top. That's the most important thing. So with that in mind, the first question goes to Gene Crowder.
Well, just absolutely horrid. And I've been in that position myself, so I'd like to know what you're going to do to correct that.
They were talking about health care there. You missed the very beginning of it. She was talking about wait lists specifically. What would New Democrats do to ease wait lists?
Well, the New Democrats actually put forward a proposal that looked at keeping public money in the public system and talking about reinvesting in doctors and nurses, making sure that we are having doctors both in the system, practicing in the public system versus the private system, and looking at alternate methods of delivery as well. So we would also include things like home care, which would take people out of the acute care system, which would reduce the wait list for the acute care bids in the hospitals. It's also very important to talk about having a pharmacare, a national pharmacare program.
And I think you've passed 30 seconds. Gary?
Thank you, Ed. Well, first of all, we're going to bring in guaranteed wait times for a number of surgeries. Right now, joint replacement's a big one. People are waiting 18 to 24 months. It's simply unacceptable. So guaranteed wait times, I think, would go a long way. If you're not in within that time frame, you'll be able to go outside and get those services from wherever they're available and be paid for with your health care card. And lastly, the $41 billion that the current government's put into health care, we want to ensure that that actually reaches the patient and makes a difference. Right now, the wait times are getting longer. Something wrong is there.
Gary, thank you very much. Keith?
Well, we've already put money into and built an agreement with the provinces to decrease wait times in important areas such as joint replacement, cardiac surgery, and cancer treatment. We've also put in monies for 1,000 new doctors, a national strategy for mental health issues, which we know will be a second leading cause of morbidity in the entire world in the next 10 years. And we've developed a constructive solution not only to deal with prevention, human resources, but also plain hard cash to get to the bottom line to treat patients in the public system when they need it.
Okay, next over to Andrew Lewis, the Green Party. Andrew?
Well, the old line parties are really tinkering with the status quo. What they're saying is we need more money, doctors and nurses, but what we really need is to refocus our healthcare system onto healthy outcomes, and we're not doing that at the moment. We need team-based approaches to treating healthcare and treating patients so that we can reduce our healthcare waiting lists by having a team-based approach and a community-based approach. And we need to include intervention and prevention as part of our healthcare system to reduce the dollars and reduce the stress on our healthcare system.
Okay, thanks very much. We'll get back to healthcare in a couple of minutes. The next question goes to Paul Vasey from the CBC.
One of our listeners has called in with a question that you'll hear in a minute. This is directed to you, Keith Martin. During the campaign, Liberals have certainly been hammered on the subject of ethics and scandals, and here's a question from one of our listeners.
Hi, I'm Malka Casero from Victoria calling. Being a stout Liberal, but also being a parent, we teach our children that they have to pay for the consequences of their actions, and I would like to know why I should still vote for you, though I am a stout Liberal, believe in your policies, but not in your actions. Thank you.
Mr. Martin, you've got 30 seconds to answer.
Well, ma'am, thank you for the question. It's wise to look at the facts rather than the allegations, which are easy to throw at. The fact, if you're looking at Gomery, when Prime Minister Martin came in, he dealt with Gomery, monies were returned, the 12 people in Quebec who were responsible are being investigated, prosecuted for their actions, but also Prime Minister Martin has implemented a series of solutions to prevent this from ever happening again. So there's nothing more that he could have humanly done. He opened this up in a transparent and accountable way, and we stand by his manner in which he's dealt with this very difficult situation.
Gary Lunn, have the Liberals done enough to deal with this very difficult situation, do you think?
I don't believe so, Ed. I think the Canadian people deserve to have a right to hold the current government accountable. You know, they've admitted to stealing $1 million, the simple fact they paid that back. That fact alone, I believe that they have to be thrown out of office. We're going to do things differently. We're going to bring in the Federal Accountability Act, which increases a number of measures by taking power out of the Prime Minister's office. But we must never forget there were rules in place the whole time all these scandals happened, and they were broken by the current government. All the rules in the world will not stop scandals. Only honest governments will.
Mr. Lewis, Andrew, what would the Green Party do to try and stop scandals?
Well, what we're suggesting is if we want ethical politicians, we need to vote ethically, we need to vote for what we truly believe in, and stop voting out of fear and anger, because I think we'll just get bad government followed by worse government if we try to vote strategically.
Gene Crowder, the New Democrats have made a big deal about ethics in government. Do you think the Liberals have done enough?
Absolutely not. What we saw after the Gomery report or the Gomery inquiry started was the continued appointment to the Senate, for example, of Paul Martin buddies. We also saw things like Glenn Murray from Winnipeg become appointed to an environmental committee after the House said that that wasn't acceptable. So what we need to do is re-examine how lobbyists and other government appointments are made. We need to institute a system of proportional representation so that we elect our officials differently, and we need to hold our government accountable for its policies.
We'll talk a little bit more about accountability, too, and proportional representation a bit later. The next question comes in through the Times Colonist. Here's Les Lane.
Ed, and candidates, if you'll just indulge me, I want to dedicate a question to Pat Nagle's memory. He died last week here in Victoria. He's a good reporter, and he loved Canada. The question at random is private money in the public system. It's always lurking in a campaign. It surfaced again last week when Mr. Layton acknowledged that he was sent to a private clinic in Toronto. So we got a question from a reader. What is your stand on all Canadians having access to both private health care and education, as well as public health care and education?
Mr. Martin, let's begin with you, shall we? You're at a bit of odds here, aren't you, in terms of the national policy and what you think?
How did I know you were going to direct that question at me, Les Lane? It's true. My personal view is that the reality of the situation is that there are public and private realities in both education and healthcare. One-third of all healthcare comes from people's private pockets. One thing I found that was really appalling is that Jack Layton killed this government on the basis of trying to say to the government, you can't have private healthcare. Yet Jack Layton goes and accesses private healthcare when he needs it, but says to the rest of the Canadian public, you can't have what I have. I think that's the height of hypocrisy. We have to look at all models, all forms of healthcare to get the best solutions to save our public system here in Canada.
I know 30 seconds isn't a huge amount of time, but you'll have more time a little bit later. Gene Crowder, is it the height of hypocrisy, do you think, for Mr. Layton to use a public or a private clinic?
Well, we're talking about liberal desperation here. What we had is a clinic that Jack went to 10 years ago. It was a very public story at the time. It was in the Toronto Star, and it was a not-for-profit clinic. So when people start talking about height of hypocrisy, I think that's coming from the Liberal folks. I think that when we start talking about public health care, it's also misleading when people start talking about 1/3 of the dollars are spent in private health care. A lot of that money is spent on physiotherapy, on drugs, and other services like that, and I can see my time's up, so.
We'll come back to this issue again a little bit later. Gary Lunn?
Thanks, Ed. You know, our goal has to be to improve the public system so that it's there when Canadians need it. You know, there are private clinics out there. And quite frankly, I think Canadians just want to ensure they can get health care when they need it, and they can pay for it with their health care card. That has to be our fundamental principle. If there are private clinics that can deliver specific services, and they're doing them now, as long as they're publicly funded, I'm not opposed to that, but our goal, as I say, let's ensure that that $41 billion is actually reaching patients, which doesn't seem to be the case.
Andrew Lewis?
We don't need a two-tier healthcare system, and we need to avoid it at all costs. We need to be investing in our public healthcare system, and we can do it without, we don't need a two-tier healthcare system in this country.
Thank you very much. Any follow-up, gentlemen, in terms of any of the questions? You got anything you'd like to say or anything follow-up before we get to your short snapper there, Kim?
Just on that question, it struck me a while ago that education, we have public money going to a private system. Some people see it as elitist, exclusive. What's the difference between public money going into private education, as it does in BC, and going into the health system, as it's starting to, I think, in BC? They're both essential services. What's the big difference to anyone?
Jean, let's start with you.
I'd be happy to start with that. We've always advocated for public money going into a public education system as well. In fact, what we've been calling for is dedicated transfers from the federal government into the public system. We think it's important to maintain accessibility. Even within the public system, students are struggling to have access. And we've got students, I've got a 33-year-old son who still has enormous debt load from his school years. Now, we want to make sure access is available across the board for all students.
Can I respond?
Sure.
You hit a very important point, Les, is that if you're going to make private health care work as a support to the public system, what you can have, as you have in the private systems, you can't have public monies going to the private system. You have to ban what's called co-payment. Because the only reason to have a parallel private services to occur is to reduce demand from the public system without removing resources. If you do that, you strengthen the public system. If you allow co-payment, which is public monies going to private services, you will weaken the public system, and you cannot allow that.
That's what's happening in education right now, though.
That's what happens in New Zealand. In New Zealand, the reason why the private public healthcare model doesn't work in New Zealand is because they have public monies going to the private system. The reason why in European models like France and Germany and Sweden it works is you're able to have a much more blended model where you don't remove resources away from the public system, so the private system strengthens the public system.
Okay. Gary?
You know, the short answer here is, what do Canadians want? What are Canadian people looking for? They're looking for service. They want health care there that's publicly funded, and they want education there when it's publicly funded. Yes, there's independent schools, which are not for profit, and there's some public money that goes into them. But as long as the education is there and it's publicly funded and people can count on it, that's what Canadians are looking for in health care too. Canadians want to know the service is there. Again, if there's some private clinics, and let's be honest, they're here in Victoria, they're there now. As long as you can pay for them with your care card, why should we be afraid of that?
Andrew, why should we be afraid of that?
Well, if we have private healthcare setting, it's a free enterprise society. If people want to set up a private clinic, then go for it. But the problem is it's going to draw doctors and nurses out of the public healthcare system, and that is a drain on the public healthcare system. We also need to be careful about if people buy private insurance, are they going to hopscotch between public and private insurance? And the public system, I don't think that's fair. If they want to buy into a private insurance, then they can't use the public system.
Okay, well, as I say, we'll get back to healthcare in a few minutes. Kim, got a little short snapper coming up.
Well, I wanted to start with Jean Crowder. First of all, we've talked so far about national issues, but this one's a little more specific to Vancouver Island. That's sawmill workers. We've watched on this island as hundreds and hundreds of sawmill worker jobs have disappeared. Mills have closed down. We see more mills that are about to close down. What would you or your party do to help these out-of-work sawmill workers, to retrain them or find them other work, or what can you do for them?
I think there's a couple of issues. Of course, that's a big issue in my riding because it is a riding where the Island Phoenix Division is going down on March the 3rd. It's the third sawmill to go down in our area. So first of all, I think what we have to do is ban raw log exports. And I know that's a small percentage of logging on private land, and then we need to work with the provincial government to reinstitute a social contract around what happens on Crown lands. The second thing that we need to do is where there does need to be a transition in the workforce, we absolutely need to provide funds to ensure that workers and communities can make that transition from a resource-based economy into something more independent.
I got to cut you off here. Gary, if the Tories form government, will there be transition money for workers who lose their jobs in sawmills?
Absolutely, and more specifically, what we've been stating all along and been pushing the government is this industry needs help. Through this softwood lumber crisis, this has been going on for years and years. The government's dropped the ball. They failed to resolve this issue. But as an interim bridge to keep these industries alive when they're struggling, there should have been money available. We've been fighting for that. We've committed to it in our platform as an interim measure until we get this resolved. And I think our government should have been in Washington, going nose to nose with the American administration, simply saying, we've won at this 4 times at WTO. We got to resolve this now.
We're going to talk about softwood lumber in a few minutes. Mr. Martin?
Well,
in terms of transitional funding here for people that have lost their jobs.
Well, 2 things of what we've done. Number 1 is we put in $3.1 billion for funding to train people while they're in the workforce to be able to get other skills that will enable them to continue to be an integrated working member of our society. Secondly, on the issue of softwood lumber, Gary knows full well that we're not going to tell the Americans, we can't force them to do anything. But Prime Minister Martin has been very strong with this. We're now engaging in domestic challenges within the U.S. court system to be able to get the monies back the U.S. owes us.
Again, we're going to talk about softwood lumber again in a couple of minutes. Mr. Lewis, in terms of transitional funding for people that have lost their jobs, particularly on the coast and sawmills.
Well, I must say I'm frankly surprised that Ms. Crowder would say we need to ban raw log export when the provincial government, the NDP provincial government, helped close down the Ubo sawmill. And really, we shouldn't be banning raw log export. We need to take a much more considerate, pragmatic view. We need to phase it out and provide transition funding during that phasing out of raw log export.
Okay, you got her hand up. We're going to have to
just really
rebut
quickly,
that.
What we really need to do is retie our forestry products back to the community and invest in value added.
So let's just do a little poll here, all 4 of you. Hands up. Who believes that you should ban raw log exports? Okay, that's all I wanted to know. Thanks very much. Kim Emerson's got another question.
I do?
You sure do. Yeah.
Okay. This one's about trust. Trust is an important theme that's come up in this election, and election promises go along with that. Should politicians be trusted? Can the public trust politicians?
Neufeld from Victoria, BC. In 1993, the Liberals published an infamous book called The Red Book, full of a lot of promises, one of which was to scrap the GST. That never happened. How can you convince me that all the promises your parties are making will in fact be fulfilled?
Although he talks about the Liberal Red Book, you'll notice that that was a general question. You've got a blue book there, that's right. Why should that fella trust that you're going to do what you say you're going to do in that blue book? Gary, you start.
And it's a great question, and you can lose trust like that and take years to earn it back. All of our commitments have been costed out. We're cutting GST to 6% immediately and then to 5% because we don't want to do more than we can't say we're going to do. If we make 100 promises and keep 99, we lose our credibility. We've got to keep 100. So all of our commitments that we've made have been well costed out. We're sitting on surpluses of $90 to $95 billion over the next 5 years, and we want to give some of that hard-earned money back to taxpayers. But we will keep every one of our commitments.
Andrew, do you think he'll keep every one of his commitments?
Absolutely not. I mean, in the last election, for example, Gary Lunn talked about standing shoulder to shoulder with the Americans about the Iraq War, and now they're backing down on that.
What did you say?
Listen, I've always said I would not support sending troops to Iraq. I've said it back then, I'm saying it now, and Keith was actually my colleague back then. It's what I did say is that I think it was a disgrace. Our current administration was making very disparaging remarks. Good friends can disagree.
I'm going to cut you off there, and I'm not going to let you respond to this because I'm actually eating in on. That's right. I'm eating into.
First of all, we need to elect a much more diverse parliament so that we can have politicians from different parties holding the government to account, and we need to start electing Green MPs to be part of that picture.
Thank you. Keith Martin.
There are only 2 members of the former Conservative Party that voted against going into Iraq. One was the former member from Nanaimo Cowichan, who was a pacifist, and myself. The arrest voted to send our troops into Iraq, which is where we would be now if Stephen Harper was Prime Minister of Canada.
Well,
On the issue of trust, which was the question, the issue of trust, we laid out a whole series of things we wanted to do, from the child care program, done. Lowering taxes for the poor, done. Surplus budgets, done. And the list goes on.
Thank you. I'm going to get to you in just a sec. But you two guys are obviously not on the same page. You've got different stories as to what happened with the debate over Iraq.
This was an opposition motion, and it was never to send troops. It's whether we should just support our traditional allies, the Brits, and other ones going morally. But it was never to send troops, and it's very clear we did not have troops. All this is a matter of record. It can be looked up in Hansard. You know,
Gary, the Conservative caucus had all the names of all the countries that supported George Bush up there. And Stephen Harper and the Conservative caucus said, we must be with George Bush in Iraq.
That is
Those are the facts, and anybody can check up Hansard and see the voting record that only 2 people voted against going into Iraq for Canada. One was myself, and one was the former member of Parliament.
Because other than you two, nobody else was in the caucus. Jean, you have an opportunity to respond.
Yeah, I think the issue of trust, we really do have to work hard to reinstill trust in the public, and part of it is by putting in place things around accountability and ethics, and part of that has to be revamping the system of doing electoral reform with proportional representation, so we elect our politicians differently.
I'm sorry, Andrew, I got to get on to another issue here. Paul, you have another question.
You must be reading the mind of one of our listeners, because that's exactly the question that we've got for you.
Hello, my name is Jean Jenkins, and I would like to hear, particularly from the Conservative and the Liberal representatives, what they think of proportional representation and if they would steer our country in that direction.
Okay, let's begin with the Conservative.
Thanks, Ed. I absolutely agree with it. In fact, I've been speaking out in favor of this for a long time. I was part of the Yes Committee on the last provincial referendum, where I spoke at rallies supporting the referendum we had in our last provincial election. I think it's important. I've said this. Andrew can verify this. I've said it in the past. I said it at public meetings. The Green Party got 6% of the vote in the last federal election, but yet has no representation. They should have 18 seats in the House so that they have a voice. So it's something that I've long advocated for and have been pushing for, and part of our platform is to promote electoral reform in many areas.
Mr. Martin, the Democratic deficit was a big deal in the last election for Paul Martin.
I think the most important thing is not so much how you elect your members of Parliament, but the power that they have to represent their constituents when they're there. That is absolutely fundamental. And there are different forms of proportional representation, and one of the major problems I personally have is that it's not the people who select the person that represents them in the House of Commons in many cases. The party selects the member of Parliament to represent the party in the House. And I think that a fundamental principle is that the people elect and select the person that represents them, not the party.
I know the Green Party is going to support proportional representation.
Yes, and I'm disappointed with the Conservatives and the NDP, because they could have done the most honourable thing in the last Parliament and held the Liberals to account and brought about electoral reform. Jack Layton promised on election night 2004 that he would hold the Liberal government to account on electoral reform. That was his #1 thing that he said, and they failed. And so we need Greens in there to help push this agenda, because the Conservatives, they might win 40% of the vote, 60% of the seats, and 100% of the power, and that's simply not representing Canada.
First past the post. Did Mr. Layton break his word?
Absolutely not. I'm pleased to correct some information. Ed Broadbent put forward a proposal that Mauriel Boulanger accepted to start a process of looking at proportional representation. We were setting up 2 parallel committees. One was a citizens engagement process, and the other one was a parliamentary legislative process. Those 2 committees were going to do the work and come together in January and February. The Liberals backed down on that commitment, and there certainly was no real impetus from the Conservatives in the House to force that to happen. So we did our work. We couldn't get the Liberals to come to the table.
Okay, thanks very much. Les Lane, you've got another question from your readers.
Yeah, transportation, I guess it's one of the basic issues or services we expect from a government, and when you get to transportation on Vancouver Island, you end up talking about the in-end railway. The Mayor of Lake Cowichan has a question. Do you see the ENN Railway as a vital transportation link on the island? Do you support the Island Corridor Foundation's efforts to preserve that railway, and would you seek ways to assist with the refurbishment of the railway through federal money?
Let's start with Jean Crowder.
I'm pleased to say that Jack he's from my riding, and he's been an activist on this. I have supported Jack and the Foundation's initiatives all along. I think this is an important corridor. The island is growing and expanding, and we know that what we need to do is reduce our reliance on things like motor vehicle transportation and truck transportation. So this corridor would provide us with a viable way of protecting that corridor for future transportation uses.
Mr. Lund?
Yeah, thanks, Ed. You know, to describe it less as a vital link, I think that's probably difficult, but I think it's something we should work towards to try to preserve it. There's a way we can work with partnership with some private sector companies, whether you can increase tourism, if there's opportunities to look at things like that, so that it can be there in the future. I think we should expand all those opportunities, and if there's a role the federal government could play in providing some infrastructure money, I think that would be a great initiative.
Although if you guys might be able to help me on this, but I think it was the Tory government that initially decided to scrap it back under Mulroney, wasn't it? Remember when Bud Smith did his Steel Wheels tour back then? Was that a Tory government or a Liberal? Can't remember. Mr. Martin, would you support that ENN Railway?
Well, I've been working with Jack Peak and the ENN Corridor Foundation for quite a while. And I'm happy to announce that I think they're very close to being able to make this a functional commuter train. Secondly, I'm trying to make sure that this is part of our Pacific Gateway strategy that our government has put together, which is a strategic investment into transportation arteries in British Columbia that will be critical in terms of capitalizing on markets in the Far East and in strengthening our transportation arteries in BC, which will be very important for our economy here in the province.
Andrew?
Well, I'm surprised Gary would say that it's not a vital link. I think as energy prices continue to rise, we need to diversify our transport options, and this would be an ideal opportunity to help diversify our transport options for the island.
Good. Thank you very much. Paul, you have another question, a short snapper, I believe it is.
Yeah, this for Keith Martin. The softwood lumber dispute with the U.S. obviously has affected BC in big ways over the last few years. I know the government has announced some help, but why did it take so long for the government to act?
Well, we've been working with user groups on this. We were hoping to resolve this from a trade perspective because, as you know, successive trade tribunals have come down on the side of our country. But we find that the Americans want to keep it there, and that's not good enough. That's why we have taken this our tactics and taken it into the U.S., into their courts, to battle them on their soil for our producers. And I think that that's going to be the most effective way to actually get a resolution to this, because we are on the side of the angels on this.
Andrew Lewis, you're shaking your head and smirking there.
Well, side of the angels, I hardly think so. The Liberals have failed Canadians on this issue. We need to abrogate NAFTA. This is an opportunity to abrogate NAFTA.
So you want to get us out of the whole deal?
We need to renegotiate fair trade deals with the US and other countries for sure. And this is an opportunity to do just that. We need to preserve our energy resources. We need to protect our water resources, our lumber, our healthcare services, and our education services. And the whole NAFTA agreement needs to be looked at. And this is an opportunity that the Liberals are losing.
Would you agree with that? Is it NDP policy to scrap NAFTA?
No, what we have said is that NAFTA does need to be reviewed, and we would like to bring business, labor, and community together to review the NAFTA agreement. And we would definitely like to see Chapter 11 removed, because it puts us into all kinds of challenges that we don't need to be in. I think, just really quickly though, the transition money that was available under the Community Adjustment Fund for softwood did not meet community needs. And it was a convoluted, complex process that actually didn't benefit workers directly employed in the industry.
Gary, what would you do about the softwood lumber issue?
Well, Ed, the real tragedy here is, you know, we're now 2 or 3 years later, and mills are closed and the workers have lost their jobs. Yes, there's an ongoing battle, but what's going to be left at the end of it? We should have been at the plate right in the very beginning, providing money to both the workers and the industries so they could have had transition in this period. Clearly, the United States have been bullies in this. They need to be taken head on, and our government's failed at that. The results speak for themselves.
Mr. Martin has been criticized for being too tough with the Americans, hasn't he?
Well, Mr. Martin has completely...
And I mean Paul Martin, not Keith Martin.
Mr. Martin has dropped the ball on this file, and, you know, the results speak for themselves. But the fallout has been loss of thousands of jobs in British Columbia, and we did not provide any assistance to these industries in the interim, and the workers are the ones that have lost out the most.
I'm going to go back to Andrew for one quick response.
Well, in 1996, the NDP campaigned against NAFTA, and now they accept it. They're no different from the other two parties here. And really, the NDP are saying we need to link the softwood to energy tariffs, and I think that's not very mature to start a trade war with the U.S.
You're shaking your head. I got to let you respond.
Well, just really quickly, we have been consulting widely over the last 18 months with a variety of players, and they have asked us to not just come out and say abrogation. They've asked us to be responsible about looking at the impact on our economy of abrogation. So we have decided that we need to do that broad-based consultation. And in terms of putting a tax on energy exports, we have tried every other mechanism. We've got to get tough.
Okay. I should get more tough on time, but I think we're having a pretty good discussion. Kim, you've got another question.
Yeah, I want to talk about housing, in particular for young people trying to get into the housing market. We see prices going up very quickly over the past few years, and in some ways that's good news for people who own homes already, because when they sell, they make money. But for somebody trying to get into the housing market, it makes it extremely difficult. So this question is about affordable housing.
Detlef Beck, I'm from Victoria, and my issue is around affordable housing. How will the political parties support affordable housing in the inner cities, in particular in Victoria?
Let's start with the Green candidate, Mr. Lewis.
Well, that's an incredibly important issue in this region. I'm involved in affordable housing programs in my community, and our communities risk being ghettoized as young people, young working families cannot afford to buy property. So we need to work, the federal government needs to provide programs through CMHC. CMHC, though, needs to broaden its focus so that it can actually serve community needs. It's not doing that well at the moment.
Mr. Lunn, is the federal government's job to make housing affordable?
There's things we can do, and part of our platform is to provide work with the private sector, providing them with tax credits, Ed, and the hundreds of millions of dollars we want to invest there, so the private sector can have some incentives to build lower income housing. It's true, you talk to young people today, they're very frustrated. They say, I'll never be able to get in the housing market. How can I get in there the first time? I think other things we can do. I remember when I got out of high school, is the registered home ownership savings plan, where you could save money for your down payment tax-free. Those are great ideas, but we've got specific things to address this in our platform.
Keith Martin?
At the end of the day, it's going to require a multifactorial approach. It's going to require the feds, the provinces, the municipalities. It's going to require builders, realtors coming together to solve this problem, particularly here at home where it's so difficult for a lot of people getting into the market. It's going to require tax rollover provisions, changes to the tax code. It's going to require investment and monies. It's going to require cooperation at a provincial level, working with the feds, using the tax structures to assist people, using, quite frankly, cold hard cash. That combination of things is going to enable people to get access to affordable homes.
Well, the NDP in the last budget tagged $1.6 billion that was going into affordable housing for communities and Aboriginal communities, and that was a start. That didn't require any matching provincial funds. The problem is that what we've had is announcement after announcement without funds actually being spent. We've had very few new units built in this country in the last 12 years, and we have to move off of that. The other thing is we need to use programs like co-ops to encourage social housing, and CMHC surpluses. There was a bill before the House that the Liberals and the Conservatives voted down that could have seen those surpluses diverted into affordable housing.
Actually, I have to take Jane to task on this, because we put in $2 billion this year into affordable housing. Here we opened up Harrison House for older women who were having a transitional home for older women. We are working with the provinces on we've introduced the RAP program. We have put more money into the RAP program, the Skippy program, in terms of monies for refurbishing affordable homes, building new homes. That's $2 billion this year alone, and we're going to continue to do that.
Okay, I'm going to move on. Paul, I believe you're next, are you not? Yes, you are.
I'm glad you're talking about billions of dollars, because our listeners are certainly listening to all these promises that are being bandied about by all the parties. And this next question is from one of our listeners about the party's fiscal plans.
Name is Robert Katzer. The question I'd like asked to the main parties is, what will they do to pay down the debt instead of promising to spend more of our money? Thank you.
Mr. Martin, why don't you begin?
Well, sir, we've already reduced the debt by more than $60 billion, the debt that was left to us by the Conservative Party, which was, remember, back in 1993, was driving our economy into the ground. We're putting 1/3 of our monies into debt reduction, 1/3 into tax reduction, 1/3 into spending. Of all the parties here, the differences are stark. The NDP party takes economies and drives them into the ground. The Conservative Party, their budget is a $22 billion deficit, and ours is a $13 billion surplus. That's a very big difference.
Gary Lunn, you would like to respond first?
Yeah, I'm glad Keith likes to know our numbers, but we put our numbers, unlike the Liberals, we put them to independent economists, the Conference Board of Canada. They've come back, they said our plan is affordable, there will be surpluses. We have admittedly left out the fiscal imbalance, which we believe there's enough in the surplus to negotiate after the fact. So it's, but the plan is affordable. We believe the debt should be a line item in your budget. Homeowners know how much they're going to pay each month in their home. So should the federal government. We shouldn't just be relying on surpluses in good times. We should have a plan, and that's the amount of taxes that we should be collecting. But debt repayment is very important in any budget.
I'm going to give Gina an opportunity first to talk about driving economies into the ground.
Stats Canada did a study, and over the last 10 years, NDP governments had the best track record of any government in Canada. Stats Canada did this study. And in 2001, when the NDP left this province, they left the largest surplus in the BC's history. That mythology has to quit. When you're talking about, we're committed to balanced budgets. Jack Layton was a Toronto City Councillor. Municipal councils must balance their budgets. Many of us are municipal councillors. We're used to working in a fiscally responsible way, and we're committed to that.
I'm going to let Andrew go first. Andrew Lewis, just from the Green Party, go ahead.
Yes, well, we do have an outstanding $500 billion debt, which the Conservatives and Liberals managed to chalk up in the 70s and 80s, and we need to deal with it. But nobody, except the Green Party, is talking about an ecological debt. We can pay off financial debts, but what about the ecological debt of species extinction, of damaged watersheds, of lost forests, and running out of oil? What about that kind of debt? Nobody's addressing that except the Green Party. We need an economic plan that deals with that.
We have some environmental questions coming up if we have time for them, but I got to give Mr. Martin a time to respond to what I think it was initially from Gary Lunn.
Well, the facts is that the Liberal Party has had 8 successive surplus budgets. The current budgetary system, Gary, using your stats show that you're going to have a $22 billion deficit. Ours is a $13 billion surplus. And the NDP, Gene,
we have put our
people forget
budgets.
Glenn Clark, people forget Bob Ray, people forget what happened in the province of British Columbia, where the NDP drove this economy in our province into the ground.
Okay, I got to stop you there.
And the public remember that very well.
I've got to move on. Any follow-ups, you guys? Anything that you would like to say?
That's good.
No? Okay. Les.
Sewage treatment, Victoria, it's getting pretty old as a topic, but it's, I think, compelling politically, because I know all 4 of you are solidly in favor of federal money going to sewage treatment. But the incumbent MP for Victoria, a leading environmentalist in Canada, says we don't need it, waste of money, natural treatment. So a reader, I think a skeptical reader, says since all the federal parties now appear to be backing secondary treatment, he wants to know what would be gained by this, other than this expenditure of a lot of our money, other than votes for you. He does not believe there is any evidence that normal household waste is harmful to the Strait of Juan de Fuca. That's from Mr. Carson in Victoria.
Shall we begin with Mr. Lewis, the Green Party? Do you think it's worthwhile to spend money on sewage treatment?
I think ultimately it's a question of ethics. Should we be polluting our greater environment, our landscape? And when we have orca being washed up on the shore, being classified as toxic waste because of the pollution out there, when we are advised not to eat a certain number of salmon because they're flowing through that toxic waste, then surely that it affects us. And we have also an ethical responsibility, plus an economic one. People are threatening not to come to Victoria because of our habit of raw sewage dumping. So economic and ethics.
Jean Crowder, would you like to go next?
Absolutely. I think that people have spoken very clearly that they want this dealt with, and there are three things about this. One of them is we expect our capital city of the province to demonstrate some leadership. And when the capital city of the province is dumping raw sewage, it doesn't look very good for us.
Is it perception then, as opposed to what's really required scientifically?
Well, my understanding is that we can't actually control what people dump into the system, so you can't guarantee me that other items that are going to impact on the environment aren't being dumped.
Caroline.
And there's science on both sides of this issue. But the short answer is we're pumping hundreds of millions of liters of raw sewage straight into the ocean. Is that acceptable in today's? I would suggest it's not. In a city, the capital of British Columbia, I'm glad Mr. Harper led on this and announced that the federal government would put in its share of funding for primary treatment, and the other parties came on board. But the NDP were in power provincially 8 years and did nothing. The Liberals have been around for a dozen years in Ottawa and have done nothing. And only after the Conservatives took initiative, took the lead, and said something should be done, did they finally all of a sudden say,
Mr.
yeah,
Martin,
we agree.
Was it a Conservative idea?
Well, there's so much emotion that's been laden around this. And it would be easy for me to stand up here and say yes to $500 million, which is what a secondary treatment plant would cost in Victoria, but I'm not going to do that. Whether a secondary treatment plant is in Victoria or not will be based on the facts and on the science. It will not be based on emotion. That would be an irresponsible thing to do. And in fact, that's what David Anderson, our former Minister of the Environment, is talking about, and I fully support his position.
Andrew, I'm not going to let you jump in on this because I want to get one more question in. Kim? I'm sorry, Les, we've got a short snapper that we've taken out for you.
This is about post-secondary education. Students traditionally have a low turnout at the polls, but they have a high debt load when they go to school and they have trouble affording post-secondary education. So this question is about how can your parties help these students out?
I have a question for the political leaders and how they plan on helping students with student loans for post-secondary education.
Gary Lunn, would you like to begin?
Sure. There's two things that I think we should be doing, Ed. Number one, our party's committed to giving every single year to post-secondary students a $500 tax credit on books. And also we've got incentives to encourage more people to go into the apprentices, $1,000 per year per apprentice, and also up to $2,000 for the employers to hire on more apprentices.
Mr. Martin, what would you propose?
Well, Prime Minister Martin has already announced that the first and fourth years of tuition would be paid for by the federal government. Secondly, we're giving monies to people while they're in the workforce to be able to afford further training to ensure that they're going to be integrated into the workforce. Those things are going to be very important to reduce the debt load on students in our country today, which is a major barrier to access, particularly to the professions and other trade opportunities.
Jean Crowder?
Well, we need to revamp the student loan program. We need to look at expanded grants programs to make sure that there's broad access. We need to have the dedicated transfer, which I talked about earlier, to make sure that provinces have the money that they need to run their post-secondary institutions. And we need to reinvest in things like research and development.
Andrew Lewis?
Well, we need to recognize that education is not just a privilege, which is rapidly what it's becoming, and we need to rationalize the scholarship and the loans and the grant programs and get rid of the Millennium Scholarship Fund, and we need to be supporting the provinces to freeze tuition fees and bring them down again.
Okay, I got one more. Just a minute. I got one more question here. We're running out of time, and it's based on an observation. There's obviously quite a bit of difference in terms of your policies, but there is also you're arguing about what happened in caucus room and what happened in an NDP government and what happened here and there. It seems to me that this is all about trust. Okay, in 20 seconds, explain why we should trust the New Democrats.
Because we have a long history of being the conscience of Canada. I mean, we've been the party that's been consistent around issues that are important to people in their everyday lives: education, pensions, EI, healthcare. We've been there for them, and I think we've got a good track record.
Mr. Lunn, why should we trust the Conservatives?
Our party policies will be all delivered. Mr. Harper, as somebody I've said I've got to know personally for a long time, he's one of the brilliantest minds I know, and this man is honest to a fault. Stephen Harper will follow through, and he demands that of every single person in his caucus.
Mr. Martin?
Well, we're the only party here that actually has a track record in the House. Prime Minister Martin set out a series of things that he wanted to do after the last election: tax reductions for the poor, the new Pacific Gateway, investments into health care, keeping our fiscal house in order, investments into health. All of those were kept.
Mr. Lewis?
Well, I believe the Green Party is the only party with a real vision for Canada, not just long-term, not just short-term gain, but long-term value. And it's clear in our principles, which that is why you can trust Green Party MPs, because we have clear, concise principles concerned about the long-term future of Canada. And it's not just short-term power. It's not just a shopping list of gains we might get in this election.
Andrew Lewis is the deputy leader of the Green Party. Keith Martin is an incumbent Liberal running for office in Esquimalt-Juan-de-Fuca. Gary Lunn is running for office in Saanich. She's a Tory. And Jean Crowder is a New Democrat running in Nanaimo-Cowichan. I'd like to thank you all for coming tonight. And I'd like to thank the panel. You guys didn't get a lot to say, unfortunately. Sorry about that.
Well, it's because of you.
Yeah, I guess I did all the talking. Kim Emerson, of course, is with CH News. Paul Vasey is the morning host at CBC Radio. And the ever-intelligent and witty Les Lane is with the Times Colonist. And I would like to thank you for joining us. We called it the Island Agenda Debate. I hope you get a bit of an idea of who you may want to vote for now, because we're a week away from the big day. Good night.